everyone, welcome back to the Shivering Mouse. I am so excited to have you back here today. Today we're going to read Chapter 5 of C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, Last in the Chronicles of Narnia, and this one's entitled How Help Came to the King. But his misery did not last long. Almost at once there came a bump, and then a second bump, and then two children were standing before him. The wood in front of him had been quite empty a second before, and he knew they had not come from behind his tree, for he would have heard them. They had simply, in fact, appeared from nowhere. He saw at a glance that they were wearing the same strange, dingy sort of clothes as the people from his dream, and he saw at a second glance that they were the youngest boy and girl out of the party of 7. "Gosh," said the boy, "that took one's breath away, I thought. Hurry up and get him untied," said the girl. "We can talk afterwards." Then she added, turning to Tyrion, "I'm sorry we've been so long. We came the moment we could." While she was speaking, the boy had produced a knife from his pocket and was quickly cutting the king's bonds. Too quickly, in fact, for the king was so stiff and numb that when the last cord was cut, he fell forward on his hands and knees and wouldn't get up again until he had brought some of the life back to his legs with a good rubbing. "I say," said the girl, "it was you, wasn't it, who appeared to us that night when we were all at supper, nearly a week ago?" "A week, fair maid," said Tyrion. "My dream led me into your world a scarce 10 minutes since." That's the usual muddle about times, Pole," said the boy. "I remember now," said Tyrion. "That too comes in all the old tales. The time of your strange land is different from ours, but, if we speak of time, 'tis time to be gone from here, for my enemies are close at hand. Will you come with me?" "Of course," said the girl. "It's you that we've come to help." Tyrion got to his feet and led them rapidly down the hill southward away from the stable. He knew well where he meant to go, but his first aim was to get to rocky places where they would leave no trail, his second to cross some water so they would leave no scent. This took them about an hour's scrambling and waiting, and while that was going on, nobody had any breath to talk. But even so, Tyrion kept on stealing glances at his companions. The wonder of walking beside creatures from another world made him feel a little dizzy, but it also made all the old stories seem far more real than they had ever seemed before. Anything might happen now. "Now," said Tyrion as they came to the head of a little valley which ran down before them into young birch trees, "we are out of danger of those villains for a space, and may walk more easily." The sun had risen, and dewdrops were twinkling on every branch, and birds were singing. "Well, what about some grub? I mean for you, sir. We too have had our breakfast," said the boy. Tyrion wondered what he meant by grub, but when the boy opened a bulgy satchel which he was carrying and pulled out a rather greasy, squashy package, he understood. He was ravenously hungry, though he hadn't thought about it until that moment. There were 2 hard-boiled egg sandwiches, 2 cheese sandwiches, and 2 with some kind of paste in them. If he hadn't been so hungry, he wouldn't have thought much of the paste, for that is the sort of food that nobody eats in Narnia. By the time he had eaten all 6 sandwiches, they had come to the bottom of the valley, and they found a mossy cliff and a little fountain bubbling out of it. All 3 stopped and drank and splashed their hot faces. "And now," said the girl as she tossed her wet hair back from her forehead, "aren't you going to tell us who you are, and why you were tied up, and what this is all about?" "With a good will, damsel," said Tyrion, "but we must keep on the march." So while they went on walking, he told them who he was and all the things that had happened to him. "And now," he said at the end, "I am going to a certain tower, one of 3 that were built in my grandsire's time to guard the lantern waste against certain perilous outlaws who dwelled there in his day. By Aslan's goodwill I was not robbed of my keys. In that tower we shall find some stores of weapons and mail, and some food also, though no better than dried biscuits. There also we can lie safe while we make our plans. And now, prithee, tell me who you are and all of your story." "I'm Eustace Scrubb, and this is Jill Pole," said the boy, "and we were here once before, ages and ages ago, more than a year by our time, and there was a chap called Prince Aurelian, and they were keeping this chap underground, and Puddleglum put his foot in—" "Ha!" cried Tyrion. "Are you then that Eustace and Jill who rescued King Rilian from his long enchantment?" "Yes, that's us," said Jill. "Oh, so he's King Rilian now, is he? Well, of course he would be. I forgot. Nay," said Tyrion. "I am the 7th descendant from him. He has been dead for over 200 years. Jill made a face. "Ugh," she said, "that's the horrible part about coming back to Narnia." But Eustace went on. "Well, now you know who we are, sire," he said, "and it was like this. The professor and Aunt Polly had got all of us friends of Narnia together." "I know not these names, Eustace," said Tyrion. "Well, they're the 2 who came into Narnia at the very beginning, the day all the animals learned to talk." "By the lion's mane!" cried Tyrion. "Those 2? Lord Diggory and the Lady Polly from the dawn of the world? And still alive in your place? The wonder and the glory of it! But tell Tell me, tell me!" "She isn't really our aunt, you know," said Eustace. "She's Miss Plummer, but we call her Aunt Polly. Well, those two got us all together, partly for fun, so that we could just have a good talk about Narnia, for of course there's no one else we can ever talk to about things like that, but partly because the professor had a feeling that, well, somehow we were wanted over here. Well, then you came in like a ghost or goodness knows what, and nearly frightened the lives out of us, and then vanished without saying a word. After that, we knew for certain that something was up. The next question was how to get here. You can't just go by wanting to. So we talked and talked, and at last the professor said that the only way out would be by magic rings. It was by those rings that he and Aunt Polly got here a long, long time ago when they were only kids, years before we younger ones were born. But the rings had all been buried in the garden of a house in London, that's our big town, sire, and the house had been sold. So then the problem was how to get at them. You'll never guess what we did in the end. Peter and Edmund, that's High King Peter, the one who spoke to you, went up to London to get into the garden from the back early in the morning before people were up. They were dressed like workmen, so that if anyone did see them, they would look like they'd come to do something about the drains. I wish I'd been with them. It must have been glorious fun. And they must have been successful, for the next day Peter sent a wire, that's a sort of message, sire, I'll explain about it some other time, to say that he'd gotten the rings, and the day after that was the day that Jill and I had to go back to school. We're the only two who are still at school, and we're at the same one. So Peter and Edmund were to meet us at a place on the way down to school and hand over the rings. It had to be us two who were to go to Narnia, you see, because the older ones couldn't come again. So we got into the train, that's the kind of thing people travel in our world, a lot of wagons chained together, and the professor and Aunt Polly and Lucy came with us. We wanted to keep together as long as we could. Well, there we were in the train, and we were just getting to the station where the others were to meet us, and I was looking out of the window to see if I could see them, when suddenly there came the most frightful jerk and a noise, and here we were in Narnia, and there was your Majesty tied up to a tree. "So you never used the rings?" said Tyrion. "No," said Eustace, "never even saw them. Aslan did it all for us in his own way, without any rings." "But the High King Peter has them," said Tyrion. "Yes," said Jill, "but I don't think that he can use them. When the other two Pevensies, Edmund and Queen Lucy, came here last, Aslan said they could never come to Narnia again. He said something of the same sort to the High King, only longer ago. You may be sure he'll come as fast as a shot if he's allowed." "Gosh," said Eustace, "it's getting hot in this sun. Are we nearly there, sire?" "Look," King Tyrion pointed. Not many yards away, gray battlements rose above the treetops, and after a minute's more walking, they came out upon a grassy, open space. The stream ran across it, and on the far side of the stream stood a squat, square tower with very few narrow windows and one heavy-looking door on the wall that faced them. Tyrion looked sharply this way and that to make sure that no enemies were in sight. Then he walked up to the tower and stood still for a moment, fishing out his bunch of keys that were inside his hunting dress on a narrow silver chain that went round his neck. It was a nice bunch of keys that he brought out, for 2 were golden and many were richly ornamented, and you could see at once they were keys made for opening solemn secret rooms and palaces, or chests and caskets of sweet-smelling wood that contained royal treasures. But the key which he now pulled out of the lock was big and plain and more rudely made. The lock was stiff, and for a moment Tyrion began to be afraid that he would not be able to turn it, but at last he did, and the door swung open with a sullen creak. "Welcome, friends," said Tyrion. "I fear that this is the best palace that the King of Narnia can now offer his guests." Tyrion was pleased to see that the 2 strangers had been well brought up. They both said not to mention it, and they were sure it was very nice. As a matter of fact, it was not particularly nice. It was rather dark and smelled very damp. There was only one room, and this room went right up to the roof. A wooden staircase in one corner led to a trap-door by which you could get out onto the battlements. There were a few rude bunks to sleep in, and a great many lockers and bundles. There was also a hearth, which looked as if nobody had lit a fire in it for a great many years. "We'd better go out and gather some firewood first thing, hadn't we?" said Jill. "Not yet, Conrad," said Tyrion. He was determined that they should not be caught unarmed, and began searching the lockers, thankfully remembering that he had always been careful to have these garrison towers inspected once a year to make sure that they were well stocked in all things needful. The bowstrings were in their coverings of oiled silk, the swords and spears were greased against rust, and the armor was kept bright in its wrappings, but there was something even better. "Look you," said Tyrion, as he drew out a long mail shirt of a curious pattern that flashed before the children's eyes. "That's funny-looking mail, sire," said Eustace. "Aye, lad," said Tyrion. "No Narnian dwarf smith this. 'Tis mail of collarmen, outlandish gear. I have ever kept a few suits of it in readiness, for I never know when I or my friends may have a reason to walk unseen in the Tisrock's land. And look, on this stone bottle. In this there is a juice which—" When we have rubbed it on our hands and faces, it'll make us look like collarmans." "Oh, hooray!" said Jill. "A disguise! I love disguises!" Tyrion showed them how to pour out a little of the juice into the palms of their hands and rub it well over their faces and necks, right down to the shoulders, then their hands right up to the elbows, and he did the same himself. "After this is hardened on us," he said, "we may wash with water and it'll never change. Nothing but oil and ashes will make us look like Narnians again. And now, sweet Jill, let us go see how this mail shirt becomes you. 'Tis something too large, yet not so much as I feared. Doubtless it belonged to a page in the train of one of their Tarkans." After the mail shirts they put on the collarman helmets, which were little round ones fitting tight to the head and having a spike on top, and then Tyrion took out a long roll of some white stuff out of the locker and wound them over the helmets until they became turbans. But the little steel spike still stuck up in the middle. He and Eustace took curved collarman swords and little round shields. There was no sword light enough for Jill, but he gave her a long straight hunting knife, which might do for a sword in a pinch. "Hast any skills with a bow, maiden?" asked Tyrion. "Nothing worth talking of," said Jill, blushing. "Scrub's not bad." "Don't you believe her, sire," said Eustace. "We've both been practicing archery ever since we got back from Narnia last time, and she's about as good as me now. Not that either of us is very much." When Tyrion gave Jill a bow and a quiver full of arrows, the next business was to light a fire, for inside the tower felt more like a cave than anything like indoors, and set one shivering. But once they got warm, gathering wood, and the sun was now at its highest, once the blaze was roaring up the chimney, the place began to look cheerful. Dinner was, however, a dull meal, for the best they could do was to pound up some other hard biscuit which they had found in the locker, and pour into it some boiling water with salt so as to make a kind of porridge, and, of course, there was nothing to drink but water. "I'd wish we'd brought a packet of tea," said Jill. "Or a tin of cocoa," said Eustace. "A firkin or so of good wine in each of these towers would have not gone amiss," said Tyrion. Next is Chapter 6, A Good Night's Work.